Blessings, good evening. Tuesday night, we have a few questions have come in. So, first question, Ajahn Kalyano, could you share insights regarding healing from generational and childhood trauma? Well, we all are here to end stress and suffering. Everybody has their different kinds of suffering they've experienced in the past or are currently experiencing, depending on karma. So some of the suffering we experience is, you might say, accumulated karma, habitual karma, that we followed the mental defilements over and over again through our life, often beginning when we're kids. Of course, everybody has to receive the fruits of their past karma, good and bad. Unfortunately, sometimes we have a store of bad karma ready to give its fruit. Even kids have to go through suffering. Sometimes they have accidents and illness and get bullied and abused sometimes. And luckily, kids have a lot of happiness as well, a lot of joy. They usually find it easy to be joyful. Nevertheless, sometimes things don't go so well. So when that happens, when we're just reflecting either personally on your own past or childhood or someone else's, the sort of general reflection is, well, somebody has karma coming up. When we say, why does this happen? Why did I get bullied? Why did I get abused? Why did this terrible thing happen? Well, the easy solution, easy comment is karma. And the Buddhist teaching that not only do we live this one life, but we've lived in previous lives, would help explain why sometimes bad things happen as well as sometimes good things happen out of the blue. There may be causes lying in the distant past or the near past, and they're coming up. But of course, if someone is suffering, that's maybe not so helpful to go into that, because that's not going to reassure them maybe. If someone's suffering, they need compassion maybe is the first response. So if you're a friend or a family member and someone you know is suffering, you don't need to go into, well, what karma did I do to deserve this? That's not going to be very helpful. Often we do it to ourselves when people are ill or experiencing trauma, suffering of some kind. They often start to blame themselves. They say, oh, I'm a bad person, I've done something bad, this is why this has happened. But that's not very helpful. If you're going through stress, your aim is not to make it worse, not to compound it by getting caught into this sort of negative self-aversion, self-blaming. The Buddha said we need to cultivate patience when we face suffering and difficulty, whatever it is, whether it's physical suffering, like illness or accident, injury, or mental suffering, or both. And the first thing is we need patience, and to remind ourselves to be patient, or if you're helping someone else, help them to be patient with what they're going through. It's part of life that some things are painful and beyond our control. You can't stop them. Sometimes it's just like that. But having established patience, then the next thing might be to try to bring up awareness, especially if you're suffering memories, reliving previous experiences, which may actually be over now, but you're bringing that, or the memory comes up. Try to establish enough mindfulness in that moment when the feelings, the emotions, the memories are coming up, to know this is a memory. This is something that's been triggered by a past experience, such as PTSD or a terrible memory, to try and establish enough mindfulness to know this is a memory. Rather than going into the blaming others, blaming oneself, but just to really try and establish mindfulness and see what's going on in the present moment, which is that there is a feeling and a memory arising in whatever way, and to know that much. And if you're mindful, maybe you might reflect, well, this has happened in the past, it's no longer the truth in the present. If it's whatever happened is over, physically over, mentally over, now you're just experiencing the karma from this past event. To have enough clarity to say that to yourself, to acknowledge it, but then to allow it just to pass. And that's again why you need some patience to do that. And if you're patient, well, through time, through practice and through positive inputs, the strength of that traumatic experience, the amount of emotion, the amount of suffering that comes up will hopefully subside, get less and less if you're no longer feeding it, no longer clinging to it and building suffering out of it, but just allowing it to fade because you're practicing mindfulness, developing some insight into impermanence. You can allow it to fade and it will come up less and less. But when we're not mindful, what you have to be careful is we start to prolong it, holding on to negative thoughts, blaming ourselves, blaming others, maybe go to feelings of guilt, self-hatred or hatred towards others. And that prolongs the whole thing. So you have to try and catch yourself and see what you may be doing in that case and change that. Bring up the patience, the compassion, the kindness, the knowledge that whatever has happened and it's over. The good that you did or others have done is good, but it's finished. The bad that you or others have done is finished. And to keep that mindfulness that the past is the past. Then there's a chance to move on from it and let it go, ultimately to let it subside and look back at it and just know, well, that happened, but it's over, it's finished. Obviously we can learn, once we have established mindfulness, it allows your intelligence to function. So you can learn from these memories or the feelings, the emotions that come up. You can learn from them. At the very least you can maybe gain some insight into what is wholesome, skillful behaviour and what is unwholesome. So if you've been the victim of some kind of abuse or bullying or people have hurt you, you can reflect now that is not good behaviour and make your own determination not to copy it, not to repeat it yourself. If someone's hurt you, you tend to go two ways, don't you, in your response. You either want to do the same back to them or even to someone else, or having seen the suffering of it, you say, no, I'm never going to do that. I can see how painful it is. I'm not going to do it because it hurt me so much. I don't want others to hurt in the same way. That's compassion. So you either go the way of compassion or the way of hatred. And you need to have the mindfulness and then the use your intelligence to gain some wisdom and understanding, so that ultimately you're going the way of compassion, wisdom and letting go. You're not compounding it, you're not seeking revenge. Those thoughts may come up, but you want to try and let them go. Better to find peace, happiness in the present moment than to seek revenge. And you don't have to hurt other people to get peace and happiness. You'll get more peaceful and more happy if you let go. And as far as other people, if they've done bad things, well, they'll have to go through the karma that results from that. That's karma. No one escapes the results of karma, good or bad. So the good you or others have done will always bring good results. The bad, unskillful karma you or others have done will always bring bad, unskillful, unpleasant results. That's a law of nature. Whether you're Buddhist or not, or you believe it or not, it's happening all the time. But you don't need to make it worse for other people. They will have their own karma and the results to go through. That's why you can let go. You think about it, the Buddha and all those meditators who've gained insight into karma, past karma, good and bad karma, and the results of karma, they can probably remember all kinds of horrible things people have said and done to them or to others, but they establish their mind in mindfulness and they reflect wisely. That's evil, bad karma. Those people will suffer. They don't have to pursue a vendetta or seek revenge. They just know that bad karma will catch up with them. That way you go beyond the bad karma by understanding it as impermanent suffering, not self, and letting go. So even enlightened beings still have to receive the fruits of their past karma. Maybe they've been cruel or a bully or done some bad things, but now they understand the error of their past ways. They just accept them. I may have to receive the fruits of that karma. So like Venerable Mahamoggallana was always having people trying to attack him and kill him because in a previous life he'd killed his own mother. Venerable Angulimala had murdered many people. So even when he had developed pure insight, let go of the attachment to his 5 khandhas, seen his own 5 khandhas as not self, he became an arahant. He still had, wherever he went, had people hate him because he was known as a murderer. That was his reputation. Even though he no longer had the thought to kill, his mind was completely pure, completely full of compassion. But other people didn't know that necessarily. They just knew him as a murderer. So when they saw him, they would shout at him, throw stones, spit on him. They didn't want to help him. But he knew that's his old karma coming back to him. But his mind didn't create suffering out of it. So the Buddha said, if you give in to your anger, your hatred, even in the face of being bullied, hurt by others, you're wrong. You're not following the way of the Buddha. You're giving in to unwholesome mental states, kilesa. Like the simile of the saw. If somebody grabs you, they start sawing your limbs off one by one, inflicting terrible pain on you. The Buddha said, if you give in to anger and thoughts of hatred towards those people, you're not following what he taught. You just have to accept, bad karma, they're sawing my arm off at the moment. Oh well. I just have to grin and bear it, but don't get angry, otherwise you're not following the Buddha. So he set a very high standard. It may sound like it's impossible standard, but an arahant has completely gone beyond anger, and occasionally arahants get hurt and bullied and attacked. But they don't make suffering out of it. They don't attach to the the emotion, the feeling, the pain of the body. You just know it as not self. Next question. If one harbours a negative thought of something, an example is one wants to kill that person, but the person doesn't end up doing it, what are the karma consequences? So you have the thought to kill, but you don't do it. What are the consequences? It depends on how much intention and strength of intention there was behind that thought, wanting to kill someone. So we're all receiving the fruits of our past karma every moment, and some of that means you've thought something before and it will just pop up. We often say random thoughts, but they're not random, they're things we've thought before, or there are connections and karma leading up to that moment where this thought pops into your mind. So it could even be an extreme horrible thought, or a very pure thought, a very kind, compassionate thought, which seems to come out of nowhere. You're not sitting down planning it, it just pops up into the mind. Old karma. The important thing, well, what happens next? So if you have, someone is annoying you or getting you angry, and the thought, it triggers a thought, I wish they were dead, or I want to kill them to get them out of my life. If that really came up, if you're making good karma at that moment, you say, I can't think like that. That's a terrible thought. This, what we call the sense of shame and the awareness of karma and its consequences come up. And these qualities, hiri and ottappa, are called the guardians of the world. They're like your guardian angels in your own mind. If you have a clear understanding of good and bad karma, those qualities will come up and say, oh, stop thinking like that. Maybe have a conversation with yourself, as if you're talking to a teacher or a wise person, but you're just doing it yourself. You say, oh, don't think like that. That's a terrible thought. There's no need to blame yourself to have the thought in the first place. It can happen, especially if you're under pressure in some way, or you've thought it many times before when you were not practicing the Dhamma. You got used to thinking, I'm going to kill everyone I hate, if that's the way you think. Maybe you have a bad habit of planning how to murder your enemies. But now you're practicing the Dhamma, following the way of the Buddha, you try to cultivate hiri and ottappa. So when that thought comes up, you say, no, I will not follow that thought. You try to abandon it quickly. Ideally, straight away, immediately you abandon it, and that's the end of it. And you make good karma because you abandon it with clarity and sense of shame, fear of wrongdoing. But if you're in a situation where you're kind of provoked, someone is really getting at you, well, you may have that thought, I wish they were dead, or I want to just destroy them. So it may take a bit of effort to let go of that thought because they're provoking you or hurting you perhaps. So you have to work harder, but your goal is still the same. You want to abandon that thought, not act on it. It doesn't mean to say you can't do something to protect yourself in that situation, but the way you protect yourself is not by killing, it's maybe seeking help or advice or doing whatever you can, learning ways to protect yourself, stand up for yourself in situations, but without physically hurting or killing others. So it may take more effort if you're particularly angry, or if there's a difficult situation where you're being provoked or attacked in some way. But still, the aim is not to have that thought in mind, not to follow it, but to abandon it. And again, like Venerable Mahamoggallana, in the end he was murdered. That's how he died. And he just had no anger towards the people who were murdering him. He was an old monk, and it was like he was saying, I'm old, I've been around a long time. If I'm going to die, I can die this way. Because he knew it was karma that he couldn't escape. They were after him, so he accepted it. And that's an unusual situation, but it gives you an insight that an arahant can even just abandon attachment to the body in that way when they're old and when there's no point in living anymore because they're already very old and sick anyway. So he died at the hand of someone else. Or you might find some other solution. So you have the thought, I want to kill this person, so maybe get out of that situation. So you don't have the same provocation, then you won't risk having that thought again. So you get out of the difficult relationship or move away from that place where you're being threatened or in a difficult situation. You just move away rather than follow the thought. You find some other wise solution to the problem. Many situations are like that. As soon as you establish a precept like the thought, like the intention, I will not kill, I will not be violent towards another person or animal, then it opens up these other avenues to solve the problem. So rather than killing, you look for another solution that's not killing. It may be just running away or moving away or finding some kind of protection. If you know how to do it, maybe you talk them out of it. It can be done. I've talked people out of violence before. I wouldn't recommend it as sort of a choice, but if you're in a situation where you've got no choice, it can be done. So the whole idea of Dhamma practice is turning the unwholesome back towards the wholesome, so abandoning the thought to kill, to steal, to abuse, to take advantage of others, to lie, to whatever. Turning that into compassion, wisdom, understanding, restraint, all the good qualities. That's what you're aiming to bring up and abandon the negative. But if you do have the thought, we'll just try and recognize it as quickly as you can as an unwholesome kind of karma and abandon it. And it won't make much karma. If it's just a passing thought that you let go, not much karma is made. A little bit maybe. If you indulge it, maybe you have your fantasy, I want to murder him. And you indulge for a while. Well, that is karma, but it's not strong because it's just a thought. So try and give it up as quick as you can. When you're a monk, you're taught this, because one of the things a monk should never do is kill. If a monk kills another human being, then they're no longer a monk. It's called a parajika offence. So when we study this, we study how quite often what the law might call premeditated murder, where you plan something, then every step you take towards that act of murder, every conversation you have, every little bit of planning is already breaking a rule. It's not the rule of killing yet, it's the rule of preparing to kill or attempting to kill or giving an instruction to someone else to kill. It helps you to see that because mind moments, mental states arise and pass away. You can see how an act, whether it's killing or stealing or any number of unwholesome acts, they're always preceded by moments of thought, moments of mental states. There's the idea, maybe just imagining it, thinking, if I murdered him or her, what would it be like? How would I do it? You're just idle, kind of fantasizing perhaps, but that's already initial steps along the path, isn't it? So that's karma. And then maybe it's like a snowball, it builds momentum, gets bigger, more solid in your mind, so then you actually really try to form a solid plan. How would you do it? And you make action towards that end, and then you ultimately start to make effort towards killing, perhaps. Maybe you have a near miss, you go and buy the gun and you shoot and you miss. So then you say, I have to go back and practice shooting a bit more and then I'll go and get them again. A bit like in those cartoons in the old days, shoot and miss, goes off, practices more, then comes back and does it again. So little by little, the karma is getting more stronger and stronger until either you give up which would be good, or you complete the act, which would be terrible. So karma is usually like that. There's many moments until the final act. There's many moments preceding, and every moment there's a chance to give up, to change, to quit, and change the whole direction of your karma. And the more you understand your mind through meditation, mindfulness practice, you see everything is moments of mental states, and if you don't do anything, you're negligent, you're heedless, we say. Those moments of unwholesome, unskillful thinking, planning will gradually become stronger and come up more often, more strongly. And they'll lead to speech, action, and maybe a result. There was a further part of this question. It says, how about the bad intention to begin, despite it doesn't end up bad? Well, that would be like attempted murder. You stand on the cliff with the boulder and they walk underneath and you drop it. And they walk on and you miss and it goes thud on the ground. So you have the intention, but it doesn't come to completion, but then maybe at that stage you realise, oh, this is bad, this is wrong, I'll stop. So you've always got that option that you can come to your senses. Still bad karma, attempted murder, planning murder, attempted murder would be bad karma, but not as bad as completing the act. Dear Lumpur, if the concept of a self or conceit needs to be abandoned, what is driving our desire to practice? Well, I would summarize it as nobody likes to suffer. Nobody likes physical pain, nobody likes mental pain. And so partly it's a process of elimination. You're looking, well, why do I have this pain? Why do I suffer? Why has my life got suffering in it? And you start looking. And maybe you come across the Dhamma, you hear the Dhamma, you meet people who practice, you read books and so on. You come across the Dhamma and this says, this is one way you can practice to get away and get out of pain, to end your pain. You go, aha. Faith arises and you start moving towards practice. It starts as an idea, hearing, listening, thinking, oh yeah, that sounds correct, what the Buddha taught, or maybe a teacher, a living teacher, it sounds correct, sounds right, and there are various things that attract you to the Dhamma. Maybe you meet peaceful people, wise people, compassionate people, and then you want to practice. So it leads on to your own efforts in the practice. So of course when you start, you still have the idea of a self. There's me and I have my suffering. And when you're suffering, you generally have a strong sense of self. That's why you suffer. It's coming from craving, clinging, and part of that clinging is to the idea of self. Clinging to your body, clinging to your feelings, your thoughts, your memories, your consciousness. So as you practice this process of elimination, you're seeing where is the suffering coming from. Oh, it's coming from attachment to the body. And you ask questions. Oh, this body, is it really a self? Is it really something I should attach to? If I attach to it, what happens? Oh, I suffer because bodies get old, sick and die. What about feelings? I feel things, pleasure, pain. But if I attach to feelings as self, I suffer because pleasant feeling doesn't last, so I get annoyed that I lose it. And painful feeling I don't like, so that when that comes along I'm not happy. And they're constantly alternating. you sort of go like this and you start looking at where suffering arises and what you can do to abandon it. You say, if you can be more aware, more mindful, see that suffering is something that has its causes, but if you are aware of that and you start to abandon the causes or change the way you do things in your mind, then suffering gets less. And your practice deepens because you realize this is working. You are suffering less. You say, oh, it works. I should carry on letting go of my attachments, my cravings, because I feel better. And that involves letting go of the sense of self. Maybe you get to the point where you identify wherever a little bit of self arises in your experience, there'll be suffering. So you get to the point where you don't want to let any self arise. Any kind of attachment to self, sort of, is where suffering arises. So whether it's feelings, the body, thoughts, ideas, memories, desires, all of it, you realize, wherever I let the sense of self arise, I start to suffer. So you keep letting go to the point where it doesn't arise anymore, because you know it will cause suffering. You might say that's nibbana. But you have to do that through your practice. At first you just hear the theory, the Four Noble Truths, and the way of practice you hear it, but then you have to practice it, and little by little you identify, wherever there's an attachment to self, there's suffering. You don't have to kill yourself, you don't have to destroy yourself, you simply have to understand that this mental idea of a self is suffering, so don't create it. Mindfulness and wisdom, what do the non-creating, the non-attaching. Ultimately, those are impersonal qualities of mind. But at first, we practice. I'm practicing mindfulness. I'm practicing wisdom. So you have a sense of self. You work with that, but you have to accept that. You've got to start somewhere. So maybe you develop a good self first, one that doesn't hurt other people or create a lot of confusion and suffering for oneself or others. We say one who makes good karma and abandons bad karma, but ultimately you go beyond all karma making, good and bad. And you just notice, don't you, when you meditate, when mindfulness is strong, insight is clear, the sense of self seems to disappear. So this abandoning this attachment to self, already, you may not have reached Nibbana, but you already feel better. You say, when I'm, say, watching the breath and the mind becomes at one with the breath, the whole world changes. My world and my experience of the world changes. I feel very light, relaxed in the body, in the mind. There's no suffering being created at that moment. You say, this is good. So it gives you a clue. This is the sort of thing you have to do with your mind to go beyond suffering. You have to train it in mindfulness and letting go of negative states of mind. You may say, I'm a person, this is myself, the new peaceful self when you meditate. So at first you might attach to that with a sense of self, but gradually you keep investigating, and you'll see, even that peace, there's no self there. Doesn't mean to say it's wrong, it just means, or it's not worth doing anything, it's not worth doing or developing. It is, but there's no self to attach to in that. So you say, well, who gets enlightened if there's no self? We could say that the Noble Eightfold Path gets enlightened. The Noble Eightfold Path doesn't belong to anyone. It isn't a person. These are qualities and insights that one develops. But ultimately the sense of self disappears, and that's what the whole point. That's why suffering disappears, it's because there's no more self. Another question. Why does one only come to the realization of losing a person or a pet when he or she is close to dying? Well, it's not always when they're close to dying. It could be just a mistaken thought they have died when they didn't die, or they're lost when they're still alive but they're just lost, or something like that. It could come up like that. But generally death is a very powerful experience, so getting close to death really makes you aware of yourself and the emotions and the attachments that come up, and then your connection to others and the impending separation from others becomes very clear. So then you'll see your emotions, won't you? If someone you love and being with for a long time is about to die, you feel it. Or if you are about to die, you feel it in your separation from the ones you'll leave behind. That's very strong, isn't it? It's like up until that point the mind didn't believe that it would happen. I've never really been close to death, really. I mean, maybe just for a few moments in a car or something. But you can see if you were close to death, this sort of clinging to life will come up. Partly that's clinging to people, partly it's clinging to whatever things you identify with. And until that point, you kind of don't believe. And that's part of our problem, part of our delusion, is that we don't really believe that things are impermanent until it's forced upon us by circumstances. So that's why when someone really dies, it's like, oh, they really have gone, and it can be overwhelming. But until that point, there's always a bit of the mind that kind of won't accept death and clinging on, hoping for the best. Maybe I'll just live a bit longer, maybe I'll be cured from my illness or recover from this terrible situation. If we're honest, I think that's a lot of the mind is doing that. It's just trying to cling on. But maybe at some point, sooner or later, the mind gives up. And that can be another unusual experience. Somebody who may be very ill, maybe in bed or very weak, and they realize finally, I'm not going to get beyond this. This body is just finished. So they actually give up, and that may mean that when they become unconscious or whatever, they die, because mentally they've also given up, as well as physically the body not working anymore. Mentally the mind has given up. In the same way, some people get very ill, but they don't give up, and they really cling on to life, and that maybe that desire to live can pull them through that illness. Just the mental energy can work both ways. But the mind, unless you've done a lot of development of a lot of insight into impermanence, it never quite accepts the impermanence of life until it has no choice and you actually die. This is why the Buddha said it, contemplate it every day. I will not live forever. Old age, sickness and death, these are totally normal and they're inevitable. And separation from everyone I love and like is inevitable. If you reflect on that every day, your mind becomes to see it more and more. Then when it finally comes, it can accept it, so maybe it isn't so overwhelming. And emotionally you can cope with it. Dear Luang Por, our Lord Buddha gained enlightenment through his own effort. Did he also practice the Noble Eightfold Path? Well, I would say he did, because that's what he taught. This is the way to end suffering, go beyond samsara, the cycle of birth and death, to go towards the deathless nibbana. Cultivate this path, the one path, the Noble Eightfold Path. But because he was the first, it's hard to know, but perhaps he wasn't sitting there going, now I'm going to practice samma ditthi, right view, right thought. He was doing it in a very pure way, in his pure sincere intention to root out the causes of suffering, abandon them, free his mind from all attachment, all suffering. once he'd done it, then he kind of went back and reflected what led to what. So what was the path that led up to this realization of the deathless, of the end of suffering? Perhaps it was like that. So he reviewed what he had done, and that's where the Noble Eightfold Path came about. I did this, I went here, I did that, practiced like this, cultivated this, abandoned that, until he's completely clear what is the path, what is not the path, what needs to be cultivated and realized, what needs to be abandoned. Then he starts teaching, and as he's teaching, he's got to teach many people, so he starts to teach in a more structured, formalized way, little by little, explaining it more and more to different people, and sometimes from different angles, but always basing his teachings within the framework of the Four Noble Truths. And the fourth of the Noble Truths is the path, Magga, the Noble Eightfold Path. But he would also teach, dukkha, what is suffering, samudaya, the cause of suffering, nirodha, the cessation of suffering, magga, the path leading to the cessation of suffering. He'd be talking around these four themes. And sometimes he even prepared the ground. Over time he found that sometimes teaching the Four Noble Truths too quickly, some people are not ready for that, so he'd teach them dana, sila, teach them just to be good human beings first, so they had a more of a sense of happiness, felt at ease, happy within themselves. Then he could teach the Four Noble Truths. Teach them to see the cause of suffering as attachment, craving and attachment. He didn't always teach that first off, because maybe people needed something else to calm themselves down. Some people have a lot of stress and you can't yet teach them the Four Noble Truths because they're not peaceful enough to understand. So teaches them ways to just bring the mind to calm, bring up some joy, some happiness, hearing Dhamma, helping people, practicing dana, letting go in different ways. So if you study the suttas and the way the Buddha taught, there's a variety of different situations and way he introduced the Dhamma, but ultimately is getting people to investigate the Four Noble Truths, cultivate Magga, the Eightfold Noble Path, and then reach the deathless. And that was all based on his own experience, his own understanding. So yeah, of course, he cultivated the Eightfold Noble Path, but perhaps he developed it more as a Noble Eightfold Path to be taught to others through teaching. I would imagine he himself, the Buddha under the Bodhi tree, has a lot of just intuitive insight going ahead, probably very pure and very fast, maybe very swift insight, and then only as he's teaching people later does it start to come out in a more structured, formal way, perhaps. That's just me guessing. Dear Luang Por, in the Samyutta Nikaya, the Buddha mentioned that the mind is impermanent. Was he referring to the five aggregates of the mind? Well, we chant this regularly, sabbe sankhara anicca. All conditions are impermanent. And when we say all conditions, we mean nama dhamma, means mental conditions, mental activity, and rupa dhamma, physical. So the physical, material world, the mental world are all impermanent. Sabbe sankhara dukkha. So all conditions are impermanent and dukkha. They're subject to pain, decline, degeneration, suffering in one way or another. They can't bring you permanent happiness because they're impermanent. Sabbe dhamma anatta. All dhammas are without self, void of self, free of self, don't exist as a self. So these are three sort of fundamental reflections that the Buddha gave. So if something is impermanent, it's going to be dukkha, suffering. So the mind, still afflicted by delusion, ignorance, will attach to the five khandhas as self, or in some way or other see the khandhas as self or within self or part of self. There's many views, wrong views we can hold about these 5 khandhas. But if the mind is still subject to impermanence, that mind is still deluded, it's still suffering. It's arising and ceasing, moments of consciousness, moments of thought. One moment leading to another moment, one moment being a cause for the next moment. So you think one thought and there'll be a cause for you to think another thought, and so on. But we do know the Nibbana is the deathless. You could say Nibbana is permanent. It's without suffering and it's without birth and death. So that's something that is not impermanent. So that means whatever the mind is that knows Nibbana or experiences Nibbana is not impermanent. It's not born, it doesn't die. So it's not the 5 khandhas. There's a difference there. But to know that, know the unconditioned, one has to train the mind, using the 5 khandhas, using what you've got, body and mind, cultivating this path, can bring you to the unconditioned, to know that. And it's the unconditioned, it's the unborn, the undying. No more birth, no more death. So Nibbana is the highest happiness because there's no more birth and death. No more wrinkles, no more backaches, no more illness, no more problems, no more taxes to pay, no more irritating things. Whatever irritates you in life, no more of that. Irritation arises and ceases, doesn't it? It's a mental state of irritation. It's too hot, too cold, backache, hungry, full. People say nice things, people say bad things. It's all some form of dukkha, isn't it? And it arises and ceases, it's impermanent. The mind of Nibbana is not like that. The mind of Nibbana is, you might say, constant. It's the undying. So, some reflections for tonight. We'll leave it there.